Welcome to the Golden State Association of Christian Schools Catalyst Series. Today I have a guest with us, Dr. Donna Bergman, and she is coming all the way from Michigan, so she has come to California to warm up during the winter months. And I'm very excited to introduce you to Dr. Bergman. In this series that we are doing for you, we are wanting to focus in on helping teachers help students who struggle. And so, as you can imagine, it will focus a little bit more on special education. And my goal is to encourage what I would term layman teachers who maybe are not certified in special education, don't have the formal training in special education, to be able to give you tools that you can use to help students learn better in the classroom. And so Dr. Bergman is here. She has extensive experience in the field of education. She has worked at the K-12 level, at the college level, at the graduate level, and also seminary level. And so I'm thrilled to have her expert help with us today. She has multiple certifications in special education and has overseen what I would call quality control of academics in multiple institutions. She is currently an adjunct professor at Maranatha Baptist University and also resides on the advisory committees for the Michigan Department of Education. So welcome, Dr. Bergman.
Thank you very much.
I very much appreciate your help here as we dive into a topic that is very broad, but very needful in this area of special education, and how we, and I would consider myself a layman teacher in this area where I don't have a lot of experience with it. I don't have a lot of training with it. Any training I have done has been mostly personal research. So definitely nothing formal training on it. And I imagine that several of our Christian schools, especially our member schools, are in the same boat I am, that we just really need layman help with this area of special education. So what we have designed for this series is this first series, we're going to talk about what to avoid and what to know. And I've asked Donna, Dr. Bergman, to actually share with us some taboos in technology or terminology. Taboos and terminology, all right? Okay. And so share with us some things that we should know about what to avoid, what to include.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's my desire to be able to share some things that will be helpful. And when it comes to terminology, it's a difficult situation because there's really not an absolute. The terms change constantly, sometimes with legal force behind them and sometimes just cultural. And it changes from context to context. A student with an intellectual disability, which is what it's called here in California, would be called cognitive impaired in Michigan. So again, it changes. And then the other thing is two people may view their disability differently. A student that is deaf may say that they want to be said that they are a deaf student, and another one may say, oh no, I'm hearing impaired. So it will change. But the words are important, but sometimes we just have to ask the students what their preference is. Children with disabilities or adults with disabilities is the largest minority group in the world. Wow. And so it's not just something unique to California or the United States, it's worldwide. And the thing that we need to be very sensitive to is that we show respect with the terms we use. The accepted way of referring to someone with a disability is a child with a disability, not a disabled child. A child with a learning disability, not a learning disabled child. But there are two groups that don't like that. Really? They want to celebrate their disability, and that is the deaf culture and the blind. They are fine with, in fact, they prefer you saying a deaf child or a blind child. So that is different. I never will forget when I was working on my doctoral program, there was a student that I referred to as having a hearing impairment, and he got very irate with me that it was not a disability, it was his culture. And so I learned that we don't all view it the same. But as a rule, you can use person first and be pretty sure that it's going to be accepted.
Okay, so you use the person and then the disability after that.
Right.
So a child with fill in the blank, a person with fill in the blank.
Right.
Okay.
And we need to be sensitive that not all students want their disability disclosed. They are very private about it, and they don't want people to know. Others will broadcast what their disability is, and sometimes want you to really acknowledge that you understand what they're dealing with. Some people feel that God gave them a disability to use for His glory. Johnny Erickson Tata, of course, is the greatest example of that, I think. But others are resentful, and they just don't want to have it publicized. One thing that we need to be very cautious about is not speaking in a condescending way to a child with a disability. And to understand in our own mind that disability is not necessarily equal with limitations. I had a student who, in high school, who was just an amazing young lady, and she was determined to play on the high school softball team. Now, this was a large high school in Arizona, and they usually won the state championship. So to get on that softball team seemed impossible for her because she only had the use of one arm.
Wow.
But she did it. She did it.
She did.
And then she came to me and said, I'm going to become a special ed teacher. And I thought, oh, Adria, I don't know if that's wise, but I didn't say it. I just thought it took her 6 years to get through college, but she's a special ed teacher today.
That's amazing, and probably a very good one.
I'm sure she is. So don't assume that the disability is going to limit the children, or adults for that matter. One thing that comes up sometimes is, what do you refer to the group of people with disabilities? And so I prefer the term special needs. Some people don't like to identify special, but to me it describes what we're talking about. They have special learning needs, and that doesn't mean that they don't have that they have a problem. It's just that they have needs. And another term that's accepted is exceptional learner, and I think that's a very good one too, because when we talk about IDEA, it also mentions gifted students. And so it's the full range, and sometimes we refer to our students as being twice gifted. They have a disability, but they are gifted. And so it's, I like exceptional learner too.
As a teacher, is it best to ask the parents how they wish for us to refer to their child, or if the child is a certain age, ask the child specifically? Is that the most etiquetely sound?
It's always wise to ask someone their preference. But sometimes we just use it in discussions, and we don't have that opportunity.
Correct.
The other thing about special needs is I think it helps the parents understand a little bit better that yes, their child has a disability, but they really just learn differently. It's not that they are inferior to other students. And one thing that I don't think I even need to mention with a Christian school audience, but we need to be very careful not to use terms that would be offensive, things such as mad or freak, psycho, retard. We can't allow our students to use those either. The other thing is that sometimes without thinking, I think people carelessly, like if I say, I can't find my car, and somebody says, are you blind? Well, they don't mean to be disrespectful, but that is disrespectful to a blind person. Another thing that is the term normal. And when we say they're not normal, or we refer to non-disabled population as normal, that just doesn't sit very well.
Yeah. That's a hard one too, because you see even in educational institutions where they'll have a special ed certification program and a regular ed certification program. And I think the same way. I'm like, wait a minute, aren't you saying normal and abnormal? You know, so like you said, it's broad, and we have to really be sensitive to every situation that we're walking into.
Right. When talking about a child with a disability, besides making sure that they are satisfied and pleased with the way you're referring to them, another thing we need to be careful about is how we talk to other people when referring to a child with a disability. And we don't want to just say that, like if someone's coming into a new class, oh, that's the child with the learning disability. We don't want to identify them with that. And we also need to be careful about confidentiality. I think that we all know not to go into a public place and talk about a child's disability, but sometimes we, without thinking, refer to something that indicates that they have a disability. And so we need to be careful about. Sometimes it comes up that a teacher feels that it would help the class to explain the child's disability. And that's sometimes a very good thing. But first of all, we need written permission from the parent. And then also, I think sometimes it's a good idea to ask the child if they want you to do that, or if they want to do it. And you don't want them to feel uncomfortable, but sometimes they'd like to explain what's going on. So it's just a matter of making them feel comfortable with it, and that's not always the case. And in many cases, we don't have to explain because our students are very aware. But I'm thinking especially a child with autism, or a child with cerebral palsy, or something that might stand out as being different from the other students.
This also applies when we're needing to make accommodations for students, that we don't make a big deal about it in class, that we are sensitive to how public that accommodation looks, and to the students in the classroom.
Yes, very good point. Another thing is we need to dispel the thought that the student has an illness or some disease, something that they need to be wary of, especially now with all the masks and things like that.
It's not contagious.
Another thing is that they don't all have cognitive processing problems. And sometimes we see someone with a physical disability and we think, oh, they must have a cognitive impairment, and that's not the case, but it tends to be a normal reaction of teachers, I think. The terms that we use are important, but the most important thing is that we're sensitive to the children, that we show them love and respect. And most children will let you know if you have a good relationship with them if something bothers them.
And oftentimes we can see it in their face almost immediately if we say something wrong, and being willing to go to that child and say, I'm sorry, I misspoke, I did not treat you well, and forgive me. I mean, that goes a long way.
Oh, it does.
In parent-child relationships and teacher-student relationships, how important that is to be sensitive and humble as we work with these kids. Now, Dr. Bergman talked about the taboos, what to avoid and what to know in that area, but there are certain terms that we want you to become familiar with as we move into some of the basics about special education and how we as teachers can help our students learn better and be even more just accepting of how God created them. And that would be one of our goals. So what we have done is we have put together the 13 individual, what would we call them, special education services that the government has kind of defined for us,
Well,
right?
IDEA lists 13 disability categories, and that's
Okay.
what we're talking about, is the actual disabilities. Because if a student doesn't fall under one of those categories, they do not qualify for special education services.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to highlight and define those 13 categories with you. We won't take a lot of time with each category because our goal later in this series is to kind of pull out one specific one and get into the weeds, as we would call it around here, and really define it, show symptoms of it, and such a little bit more. But we wanted to give you the broad spectrum of it today. And so we're going to deal with those 13, and it's like a quiz. I'm going to quiz Dr. Bergman here. And so autism spectrum disability, how would we define this?
Well, autism spectrum disorder is an umbrella term. It's a spectrum. We used to just have since 1990 we had the disability of autism. And then in 2004 they changed it to autism spectrum disorder. And it includes a wide range of autism. And autism is a neurological processing disorder that exhibits itself especially in the area of communication, both verbal and nonverbal, social interaction, and repetitive behaviors. And the thing that the spectrum covers, it allows them to include high-functioning autism or Asperger's, which is on the high end of the spectrum.
Okay. Like I said, it's a brief definition. We know there's a lot involved with that, but that kind of gives you an overview. So deaf-blindness.
That's an easy one. It's a student that is deaf and blind.
Deaf and blind, okay. And then the third one that is listed in the IDEA is deafness.
It's a child that has a hearing impairment that is severe enough. There's certain parameters, but it's severe enough that it is not assisted by just having hearing aids or amplification or something like that.
Emotional and behavior disturbances.
That's such a broad area because you've got both behavior and emotions, which seem very different, and the disabilities are different. But the thing is that it has to be an impairment that affects the child in multiple settings, to a marked degree, and over a long period of time. You can't just say that a child is depressed and so they need special education services if maybe there's been something traumatic in the family. And so yes, they're depressed right now, but it has to be over a long period of time and to a marked degree so that it interferes with their learning.
Okay, that's helpful to have those parameters on that. Okay, so hearing impaired, we talked about this one with deafness.
Right.
Okay.
They definitely have a hearing disability, but it can usually be corrected with either hearing aids or amplification system, something so that they have some ability to hear.
Okay. We would call that assistive technology, where bringing in help to help them hear better.
Right.
Okay. Another one that is listed is intellectual disability.
Okay. Intellectual disability is a rather new term, and it varies from state to state, as I mentioned before, but it's the term that we used to refer to as mental retardation. And in a lot of the laws, it still is referred to as mental retardation because they haven't updated those laws. But it involves both the intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, and it's on varying degrees. You have mild to moderate, moderate to severe, and mild to moderate, and it has to be pretty pronounced for it to qualify as a disability.
And is the testing for that like with IQ? Is it really related?
It has to be multiple tests. That's part of the law, but they do give an IQ test. And they also do an analysis of adaptive behavior and usually academic functioning too.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, multiple disabilities.
That's one you probably won't run into in your schools, because multiple disabilities are those very severe disabilities where the child needs constant care. Oftentimes they can't speak or can't function in some way.
Okay. Orthopedic impairment.
And that is a physical disability, usually involving the skeletal system, but
Okay. So a child needing to be in a wheelchair, this would be an orthopedic impairment?
Yes.
Okay.
But it also, all of these disabilities, in order to qualify for special education, they have to have one of the 13 disabilities, but it also has to be interfering with their ability to learn in a general ed setting. Yeah.
Okay. Other health impairment.
That refers to a lot of physical impairments that might not fit the other categories, but they're definitely causing the child a difficulty learning. Diabetes is one. Well, it can be mild, but it can be severe. Oftentimes the child is missing a lot of school, things like that. But the big one is attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder is not in itself a disability category, and it has to be severe to receive special education services. Okay,
that's helpful, that a health situation could cause an impairment that would give you services.
Right.
All right, specific learning disability.
Okay, that's our broadest category.
Yes, it is.
Besides speech and language. And there are multiple subgroups which we'll talk about, but it's a neurological processing disorder, and it usually affects language in some way.
And in many ways, this is going to hit home to several of us, because most likely there will be one or two students in every classroom that, whether it's severe enough to be labeled as needing services, we're still noticing a learning disability or a processing issue.
They estimate that approximately 25% of the school population has some form of specific learning disability.
Wow. Speech or language impairment.
Okay. I think we're all familiar with the speech impairment. Language is one that is not diagnosed quite as often, and it's very real to our students, and it actually overlaps with specific learning disabilities. So, but it needs special assistance for many of our students.
When we say language impairment, would stuttering be in that, or would that be a speach impairment?
I think that's a speech impairment. Yeah.
So what would be a language impairment?
Where they misuse words, where they can't take and form a normal sentence, or they can't use language in some way that to us is acceptable.
Okay, so beyond like a typical dyslexia, dysprasia, would that be a language impairment, or more of a learning?
All of your specific learning disabilities involve language, so there's an overlap.
Okay.
But when we talk about someone that's receiving just speech and language services, it would have similarities to it's the content, whereas the specific learning disability addresses because it's a processing disorder, it's a neurological disorder, and it addresses a much more specific disability.
Okay. And one more question about language impairment, because it hits us especially here in California, is ESL, where English is the second language. Does that at all fit into this category?
No, it actually fits into all of them. In fact, that it is a disclaimer, so to speak.
Okay.
If a child, they cannot qualify for any of the disabilities if their learning problems or their inability to function in the classroom is caused by English as a second language, if it's caused by environmental disability or environmental situations. It has to be actually a disability-related issue.
good to know. Okay, traumatic brain injury.
Okay, traumatic brain injury actually was one of the latecomers. It was added in 1990, and it is from an outside blow to the head or something that happens. The child is a normal developing child, and then something happens that is an accident, and it affects their ability to, it can be emotional or academic, but it affects them so that they don't function in the classroom.
And one reason why this made it on the list now is because usually a TBI is a lifetime of healing, and so it just does not go away quickly even after an accident. And the last one that is on the list of 13, is visual impairment.
Okay, and that includes any visual impairment that can't be corrected with just glasses or corrective lenses of some kind.
Okay. What I've also asked Dr. Bergman to do is to help me put together all these terms that float around in our industry so that I understand them, and they all relate to special education. What is the difference between accommodation, adaptation, and modification?
Okay. Adaptation is environmental. So if I'm changing the environment for the student, that's an adaptation. You might add a ramp, you might get them a different type of desk. That's all adaptation. It has nothing to do with curriculum. The accommodation has to do with curriculum in that you can do certain things to make it more accessible for the child, but you're not changing the content of what you're teaching. Okay. And so the two that I like the most when I come to accommodations are text to voice and voice to text. Okay. Simple things on our computer, books that are audio, those don't change what the student's learning, but it changes how the student receives the information.
So a great example of this, and we'll get into this a little bit more in other parts of the series, but so accommodations, I would be giving the same test to both students, but one student would be able to read it on his own, and the other student, I would need to read it to them out loud.
Right. The other thing is you could change the direction slightly as long as what they're doing to show that they know the information is the same. So in other words, if the child needs you to explain the directions more precisely, that's acceptable.
Okay, and then modification, how does
Modifications,
that
you're actually changing what you're requiring, either in the content you're delivering or in how you're assessing. Something is pretty common practice is to make a fewer number of spelling words required.
Okay.
That's a modification. You're changing the requirement or the content of what you want them to know.
See, I would have gotten those two confused. I would have called that accommodation too, but it's not. It's
probably the one thing that people misunderstand.
Okay.
But the other thing is when you're thinking in terms of a student that's going to take a state mandated test, they can have what we call standard accommodations, and there's usually a list as to what is acceptable. A quiet room to take it, a one-on-one proctor, someone to read the questions, that sort of thing. Those are all accommodations. But once you modify the test, it can no longer be considered valid.
Okay. All right, now we're going to get into the alphabet. There's a lot of acronyms that we need to keep in mind here, and here is our first one, ABC and FBA. Before Dr. Bergman answers this one or clarifies what in the world we're talking about here, I want you to know that we're going to put a PDF file in our video notes so that you can actually download the entire terminology index that we're talking about. Plus you have bonus ones that we knew we would not have time to talk about that you'll find on there. In that index you'll find the definitions of all 13 of these services plus the definitions of these acronyms that we're going to be talking about. So ABC and FBA.
And sometimes we refer to them as alphabet soup because
yes.
That's about it. ABC stands for antecedent behavior consequence. And it's obviously a behavior term, but when we look at a child's behavior and we know that they need to adjust that behavior. And may I say, with all the behavior terms, I'm not minimizing the fact that sin is sin, and we have to deal with that. But there are some behaviors that they don't even think about that they're doing. And so we have to help and look at the antecedent. What happened just before that? A child that is not willing to start their reading, but they love math and they just had math and they really don't want to stop the math, but they're now having to read, that may be causing a behavior issue. It's an antecedent.
Oh, that's good.
It could be that they've been out to recess and they're not wanting to calm down. There's lots of things that we need to look at what happens before the behavior.
It's like making note of the trigger point.
It's exactly what it is.
Okay.
And then the behavior is the specific thing that they are doing. And we want to look at an individual behavior, because you can have a child that you've got a list of 8 things that they're doing wrong, but they may be totally different as far as their antecedents and consequences. So you look at a single behavior and you define it in very specific terms, because later if you're going to collect data on it, someone else needs to be able to look at the same behavior. The consequences is what happens after that behavior. I think of a child that every time there's an oral reading group, they have a stomach ache, or a writing assignment, and they have to go sharpen their pencil and sharpen their pencil and sharpen their pencil. Well, obviously they're getting out of that assignment. So we need to look at the behavior and see, are they able to do that behavior? Or are they being asked to do something that they feel they have to get out of, and that's the consequence.
This is really good. I asked Dr. Bergman to talk about this one because as layman teachers, we have a responsibility to log the situations going on in our classrooms. And that's one of the best things we can do to help our students, is to make record of these behaviors. So antecedent, behavior, consequence, it's almost like the ABC of recording for teachers. We have to record what is happening before that becomes the trigger point. We have to record the behavior, and we need to make note of the consequence, and so that we can better help those specialists who may be coming on the scene to help a student even further understand the whole situation that is going on. It also shows the long-term effects of this behavior. You know, is this behavior happening after this antecedent 10 times in a row? Well, now we've got a pattern that we can work with and share with and deal with, really.
Right.
So what is FBA?
Well, that's really what you're talking about. It's a functional behavior analysis. And so once you've defined the behavior and you think you have an idea what may be causing it, then you want to actually document the number of times that it's happening in usually you take a small period of time.
Right.
But if it's a behavior that only happens when they're getting ready to go home, obviously that's when you have to do it. But you start collecting data on that so that you can have a baseline over a week's time and see what is going on. Some behaviors are unique to a certain day or a certain time.
Yeah.
And so
I think it would be good to interject here is that as teachers, we're not labeling the child in this data collecting. We're not saying that, you know, there is some impairment or some disability here. We're just noting the symptoms and the trigger points and leaving the experts to the labeling and some of that.
right, and most of the time with a functional behavior assessment, if you take it a step further and do a behavior intervention plan, you just have a plan to try to help the student. There may not be any disability there. It may just be that they are misbehaving.
Right, it's true. Now, we kind of hit this already with intervention and student baseline. Obviously, intervention, one of the best things as teachers we can do is just to collect the data to begin it.
But an intervention refers to a specific process that you are going to use to try to work with an individual student to bring them to a point that they can function at a regular grade level.
Okay, that's great. And then very quickly, I wanted to just make us more aware of some acronyms here. This is more for preschool, K4 levels, but why should teachers need to know this?
Well, especially when you have a student coming in and you're reviewing the records and you see some of these things, it alerts you to the fact that at one time they were identified as having some sort of a disability. Now, before they start school, we usually give them a disability of developmentally delayed, and it is just that. Some part of their developmental process they've been delayed in. And oftentimes that actually, when they get to school, becomes an IEP with a specific one of the 13 disabilities. But they don't like to do that early on because they're so hard to diagnose in a lot of cases. There's some of these that they can diagnose right away.
So what does IFSP stand for?
That's Individual Family Service Plan.
Okay.
And that's a plan that is made with the family. It actually is a plan for what the family will do with the child, supported by an early intervention program.
Okay. And then in the K-12 department, we have IEP and 504.
Okay. IEP is the document that is developed for a child that qualifies under IDEA, having one of the 13 disability categories and not being able to function at grade level in the regular classroom. And so they need certain accommodations and modifications and intensive instruction, and that's all laid out in the individual education program.
Okay. And so with the 504 and the IEP, these are just forms that really point us to the special needs that we need to accommodate, modify.
Right. And a 504 plan is actually called a 504 Accommodation Plan.
Okay.
It's not under IDEA, it's an anti-discrimination law. And it was so that they couldn't discriminate against children in the classroom, and they usually are not able to qualify, for some reason, not able to qualify for special education, but they still need accommodations. And so that's where that comes in.
Now, some of our Christian schools, and I want to be brief because we need to finish this series up, some of our Christian schools will have children with specific learning disabilities who maybe do not have an IEP at all, but yet they're headed off to college. Would you suggest that they pursue an IEP for a 504? Or?
A 504. An IEP ceases when they complete 12th grade.
That's what I thought.
Or they can age out if they never finish. But 504 is a lifetime document, and so it will follow them not only to college but to work, and so it's definitely a good idea if you know that child has a disability of some kind.
Okay, great. And I think we'll be talking a little bit more about these in coming series. So, and then the last one, SPED, SPED.
Yeah.
That's the acronym for special education.
Right.
So,
when they passed the laws authorizing or mandating special education, they picked up that acronym.
so I trust that this has helped you. I know it has helped me tremendously to understand some of the laws, some of the ways that disabilities are labeled, and the terminology, the do's and the don'ts on it. And so we're going to keep on with this series, and I trust that you'll join us for series number 2, where we're going to talk about what to notice and how to notify. Thank you.